presenter, Jade Lim, a PhD student in Science and Technology Studies at the University of Edinburgh, with her presentation titled Breaking the Carbon Curse, Case of Brunei Darussalam.
Good morning, everybody. So if I step over here, can you hear me? Not really. Or just a little bit. Thank you very much for having me here today. Good morning to the honorable guests. Thank you for the committee for organizing this wonderful event. As introduced, I'm Jade. I'm a PhD student at the University of Edinburgh studying, Breaking the Carbon Curse is quite a fancy title. I'll explain a bit more about the context behind it, the statement of the problem with the carbon curse, trying to explain what it is exactly, the theory that is behind my research, and the recommendations that I have. So everybody, from Brunei would know about the oil and gas legacy, and the 8 decades of oil and gas industry has contributed well to the high standard of living in Brunei. We have low tariffs for electricity and water. There's no personal income tax, and that's one of the things you tell people, and they're like, oh gosh, I'm going to move to Brunei now. And the low petrol cost obviously leads to quite prominent car culture. We know how well that there's a huge, we get huge traffic jams very quickly, and it's because we drive very often and it's very cheap to drive. The problem will be that even though the oil and gas industry has contributed a lot to the country, so it's brought lots of wealth and fortune and prosperity, economic growth has not kept pace. So this is relevant to what the Dato's last presentation was just talking about, how we've got quite a small private sector and there's a weak community of local businesses. 6% of production of crude oil is domestically used while the rest is exported out of the country. There is a lot of potential for downstream productions from this crude oil, whilst half of the refined petroleum products are imported into the country. There's some of these characteristics are what is labeled as the Dutch disease, or more specifically to Brunei, the carbon curse, because it's a fossil fuel-rich country. What we find is that because of this discovery of natural resources, it leads to the crowding out of other economic activities, or neglecting other economic activities, which is in the form deindustrialization. Because when you only focus on oil and gas, and you only focus on the dominant regime, you continue on in the same pathway. Specifically to Brunei, there are 4 components to the carbon curse. One component is that the very high carbon dioxide emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from the extractive industry. The second component is because of the easy access to economic fuels, it leads to crowding effects of the energy mix as well as economic structure. The third is the fuel abundance weakens the economic incentive to invest in energy efficiency and low carbon technology. So this next slide is to just illustrate how actually our whole infrastructure in Brunei is quite linked to the oil and gas industry. The combined effects of all these mechanisms make it quite difficult for countries to evade carbon-intensive development pathways. The government, under this structure, is under quite considerable pressure to grant uneconomic subsidies to petrol costs, to all these fuel consumption subsidies. Much of my work has been interviewing stakeholders or experts in the oil and gas industry, so asking for their perception of Brunei's present and future energy scenarios. There's a prevalent lock-in to the oil and gas industry, so there's a lot of incumbent technology linked to the established infrastructure across the country. It's the firms that come into the country are concerned with trying to develop technologies in this case. The banks and businesses as well, tend to invest in the technologies that are concerned with this regime. There's a lot of the literature as well is based on energy consuming. So what we maybe should be looking at is the energy demand, and there are different energy concerns that involve when it comes to Brunei. The graphs on the right is just to illustrate how in the past 12 months, the price of crude oil and the price of gas has just plummeted. Well, it's been quite up and down and plummeted basically in the last 2 months. Because Brunei is such a small country, we have to follow a lot of the rules set by, the global context. A lot of the reasons for the fall in the prices is because of the large increase in industry in shale gas in Americas. And in response to that, a lot of big Gulf states then increase production because it is a lot cheaper to extract the conventional way compared to unconventional shale gas. And within Brunei, we get sort of stuck in between. We're a major exporter of oil and gas, but we're not strong enough to actually influence oil and gas prices like that. So we're really subject to a lot of the price volatility. A very quick sort of snapshot into the theory that's behind this. What I'm studying is the interplay that you get between society, between technology, between the actors involved and the influences that they have in policy, as well as the sort of subsequent effects you get. So transition management is one of the main ones, so concerned with the functioning of the variation, selection, reproduction process at the societal level, creating variety informed by visions of and experiments for sustainability. So shaping new pathways, reflexively adapting existing institution frameworks and regimes. A nice big picture for everybody to look at. I know it's quite complicated, but we start from the middle bit, which is the socio-technical regime. So when we talk about the oil and gas industry, sometimes it's just always about the technology, but it's about the social bits as well. How we have the culture, the science, the technology, the policy, the industry influencing our regime. So this influences our, environmental practices. This influences our just everyday life. Again, coming back to the car driving culture. You have the socio-technical landscape, which is outside the control of the regime, but has influences. So this is about multilateral agreements, maybe, or global issues like climate change that can influence the regime. The best sort of option that's great from the niche innovations. So these are controlled experiments regarding technology or regarding market mechanisms that can slightly influence the regime, and hopefully it creates new pathways. Talking about a bit more about the regime and innovations. So innovations are very important. So there's lots of it's nice to look at the schedule, and you can talk about all this different research that everybody's doing and all this technology that can be influenced up to the regime. But if you notice the diagram, there's double-ended arrows. So the regime also has quite a big effect on what the type of innovations are happening. So because our economy is very strongly based on fossil fuels, the sort of influences in the sort of policies that are made have very big impacts on the sort of innovations that are created. So there are all these other technologies all across the world that we can be adapted into Brunei, but then sometimes it's very difficult to try and find proper policies that can help establish the innovations that actually push it through the regime and actually push it through marketization and make it more of a viable prototype. The concept that I talked about before, about the lock-in effect, is, I hope that's quite established. And because of that, it extends to social institutions and customs as well. You have banks that are maybe not as happy to invest in other technologies because there's a huge risk involved. You have people who, because of the influences you get from parents or from your grandparents, and because of the industry that's available, you're influenced to maybe study courses that are more relevant to oil and gas. Actually, looking at the program, it's great that there are a lot of people branching outwards, but then when you come back to the country, it's sometimes quite hard to find out what do you do next with the job that you have. And because of the established infrastructure that we have, the established institutions that we have, it's very easy to become locked into the regular pathway. So at the same time, it locks out alternative markets and carbon-saving technologies. With this need for economic diversification, some of these, especially within the World Sound as well, some of these goals have been in our national development plans all the way from sort of 1960s. And it's it is quite difficult to try and push on. So it's nice to talk about theories and how maybe from the niche innovations you can affect the regimes, and from the regime from the landscape it affects the regime and how a new pathway can be created. It's difficult to try and transfer theories into transition. There is a bit, hopefully you see that as a bit of an issue that constitute the economic, the institutional, and the policies, but it's very important to try and identify all the different aspects and how within the system there are different parts where you can try and influence change. So thinking outside disciplinary boundaries and understanding the regime drivers that are involved. There's an emphasis on the agency of actors who can govern the transition. And this isn't just about saying that there's one person in this ministry or there's one person in VDB who can help to try and bring this forward. Sometimes, maybe in looking down to the details, that's maybe the effect that we need. But it is trying to influence people to try and think outside the box and try and not sort of stick to the same way that we've been living. Right? The very quick sort of easy illustration would be just it's a lot of oil dependency that we've had. So what do we do now? We just sort of keep drilling, and it's getting harder and harder to sort of step out of that economy. If we have any questions?
We now welcome the audience to direct questions if they wish to our exhibition presenter. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand and a member of the committee will pass a mic to you.
Hello. Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation. I would just like to say this curse is quite common in major oil-producing countries. And from your research, are there any countries that have tried to manage this problem or tried to remedy it? And if yes, what can Brunei do to assist with this problem or maybe to alleviate the curse? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. That's a very good question. For most of the research that I've done, the literature I've read, the only country that seems to move out of this sort of carbon curse. It also sort of goes back to how you describe the carbon curse. But one of the strongest examples is Norway, where they are a big oil and gas, well, oil specifically exporter, but they've not fallen to this. Oil and gas is not the dominant regime. So that if that's how it's described, oil and gas is not the dominant industry. It goes back to quite a few different factors. So when the discovery of oil and gas was created, they already had an established economic structure. So then that's a bit harder to replicate. But they also had, they understood the components that are involved and what would happen. Because they discovered oil and gas in the 1960s, they already knew about this resource curse of how it could affect your deindustrialization of the country. They decided they created a sovereign fund. So with, I don't remember the figures, I think it's about 20% from the exports revenue that they get, they put it into the fund, and they use this fund to then invest in other technologies. It's also part of their the nation pension fund. That's it. So that's sort of a few different sort of economic behaviors that can help the future. I think that's a question in the back.
Hello, that was a very good presentation. So, like from the graph, as you can see now as well, the oil process is reducing every day as we look at it, and then now it's gone maybe under $50 per barrel.
Sorry, what?
Was it gone under 50? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, especially, Brunei, most of our production is offshore, so our cost of production is quite expensive compared to like Saudis, for example, where they can produce for like $3 a barrel. So if we extrapolate that graph and then it keeps on going down, so it keeps so in a way it's a bit more unsustainable because the cost of production of Brunei's oil is quite expensive. Do you have any suggestion or solution of how to tackle that?
In terms of tackling what do you mean? In terms of trying to tackle the economy and trying to tackle what happens if the
Because
prices go so low that we
yeah,
can't-
exactly, yeah. So it's no longer sustainable to produce oil. Because we're making losses every barrel we produce.
Yeah, it could be making losses every time it goes down. Yeah, that's true. It's I think the good thing is that is an established infrastructure that's been there for 80 odd years. So the amount of money that you do lose, at least will not, it doesn't just happen in the next couple of months. It does take time to change. And the recommendations I would say is to try and invest that money that we have into other technologies, into other resources that we could use. So I know within some Ministry of Primary Affairs, no. Primary Resources, I'm really sorry. Ministry of Industry and Primary Resources have started the halal products, being the certified products, and trying to push Brunei forward into manufacturing local and halal goods. So there's things like that could incorporate it. But then I suppose it's quite hard sometimes because every time you want to invest in something, you kind of go to the Ministry of Finance and you ask them for money, and there's a lot less of this cross-lateral thing that happens, which is actually quite, so listening to Dato's presentation of how the Brunei Research Incentive Scheme, that's quite a good way to also push forward, because you can get involved in, and there's a lot of things within the BDB that people can get involved in. So there's a need for this support structure as well as the underlying factors. So thank you.
We thank our first exhibition presenter, Ms. Jade Lim,